Hello, and welcome to the Mindful Movement Podcast. I'm your host, Les Raymond. Thanks for joining me today for another episode. I recently had Jay Feldman on the podcast from the Energy Balance podcast. And today I speak with his colleague and co-host, Mike Fave. Together, Jay and Mike have put together a tremendous resource of education around the bioenergetic model of health. I have been on a journey, ups and downs and twists and turns, trying to figure out what is the optimal diet for me to thrive and be at my best. And through that journey, I've tried all kinds of different fads and diet of the day, whatever. And I know I'm not alone with that. I know many people out there struggle to try to find what really fits. Sometimes when you try a diet, it works well for a while and then it doesn't. And the bioenergetic model presents a different scaffolding to work from when you're viewing how to make decisions around food when your health is top priority. Now, what's nice about this model is it's not a eat this, don't eat that. It's try to understand the underlying principles which then could guide your decisions. And those principles are really linked to the ideas of energy. Having the demand of energy that we have, meaning the things that are required, what we're required to do all the things we want to do in life and have to do, have that demand be met by the supply of energy that our body is capable of making. And there's a lot of variables that go into that. It's not just what you eat, but how well do we convert that food that we eat into energy, and what potential insults could there be that we're exposed to that could inhibit that process, and gaining understanding about it, and then using that to kind of piece together our decisions, and then learning from that, because it might not be a perfectly smooth linear process. Now, I've gained a lot of benefits personally from the education I've got from Mike and Jay, and I wanted to have Mike on today to not just give his kind of perspective of this idea, but also get some personal help, because I'm a couple months into this process and a lot of benefits, but also some things that I'm not really sure how to navigate. So I was hoping to get some expert advice and offer an opportunity for the listeners to hear, how Mike would think about this and approach these types of issues and see what type of adjustments are worth trying going forward. So that's what the episode is essentially about. It's a little longer than usual because it's basically a regular episode, but then I kind of use Mike for my selfish reasons to get some personal advice, and that takes a little time at the end. So I hope you enjoy it, and thanks again for tuning in. All right, Mike Fave, thanks for joining me on the Mindful Movement Podcast.
Awesome. Pleasure to be here, Les. Thanks for having me.
So for the listeners, recently we had your colleague and podcast partner, Jay Feldman, on, kind of going over the bioenergetic model of health. So for the listeners, if you didn't listen to that, it might be useful to listen to that first, but I think we're gonna recap so that it's not necessary, but they definitely go hand in hand, these two episodes, interviews. I personally have found over the years, as I navigate my health and healing journey, a lot of value in hearing other people's healing journeys and learning what works and what doesn't, and then tinkering. So I was hoping that in this episode, because you coach folks on, how to apply these strategies and use this model as like a scaffolding, I guess, that you could maybe shed some insights on what I'm experiencing, some ups and downs, and maybe help others that are interested figure out how to navigate these things. Because I don't think I'm alone. And I know that you've gone through something similar that you could touch on, but trying to figure out the food puzzle of health has been really challenging over the years. In 2017, I had a a nutritionist recommend keto. I was, I guess, like paleo before that. And everything went downhill from there dietarily, it seemed. I went from keto to low carb to even lower carb to basically zero carb, then low carb, then more carb and more carb. And now I got introduced to Ray Pete a little bit and then found the Energy Balance podcast with you and Jay. And
Yep.
it's been such a tremendous wealth of education and information for me. So one, I want to thank you for your role in that.
No problem.
Yeah, I'm very grateful. As I mentioned on Jay's podcast, you guys do a tremendous job educating and providing information for folks to kind of work through it in a very methodical way. So I was hoping we could start off by reviewing a little bit of what some of the more like foundational principles are that you rely on for this bioenergetic model, especially for the listeners that haven't listened to the recent podcast with Jay.
Yeah, awesome. So again, I want to reiterate, I'm happy to be here and I appreciate the invitation. Now, as far as the basic ideas underlying the bioenergetic point of view, I just want to frame it a little bit first for the audience. It's not similar in the sense to keto or carnivore or paleo or even veganism or plant-based, because the general idea here isn't to pick one food group and then determine that food group in and of itself is the problem and then kind of like just like knock it out, or to give people necessarily a manifesto of this is the cure, this diet. The bioenergetic perspective is one of taking principles coming out of research and science and then applying them to individual context and then working out some type of lifestyle dietary perspective from there. So it's a little bit different. It's not like there's this like set of rules. It's more like there's principles and how they apply, and the actual outcomes that will come out of those principles in an individual's context will be adjusted by that individual. So the reason I say that is because you wind up having a variety of different diets, or what would look like different diets, using these principles. So your dietary intervention could be very different from mine, but we're kind of targeting the same general physiological principles. So that's the frame I want to put here, because it's not necessarily like a diet. There's on social media and whatnot, it's easier to position it that way. And there's like the Ray Pete diet and the pyramid, and people will see all that type of stuff. But if you actually start to dig a bit deeper into Ray's work, you start to see that he's playing around with different physiologic principles. And I think how this ties in very importantly into the whole mindfulness and stress management perspective is that a lot of the principles are around, or there's a big element of managing stress through these interventions, through these principles overall. So with that frame in mind, a couple basic principles to start off with, and I guess the first major one is, what is this idea of stress? And so I think that there's in a lot of these different spheres, it can be a little bit obscure as to what stress is actually defined as. And in the bioenergetic sphere, we actually kind of really break down and get into what is the stress. And the definition comes to a mismatch between an energy requirement and then the actual available energy. So as an example, and this could be psychological, this could be on a physical level, this could be on multiple different levels. It basically, the stress model is coming out of Dr. Hans Selye's general adaptation syndrome. This is where Dr. Pete kind of pulled in these ideas. And essentially what you're seeing is there's a general model of stress, and multiple factors can trigger that same pathway. And then it all comes down to about energy availability, and then what is the demand being imposed. So we have that's the first piece, is we have this specific definition of stress. It can encompass psychological stress, physical stress. It can encompass stress from a mental perspective, like doing very difficult or arduous mental tasks. whether it's working out excessively, whether it's in effects on sleep. So like all of these different areas can be encompassed through this general idea of energy demand and energy supply. So comes into like that type of logistics perspective around energy. So I guess that would be principle number one. And I don't know if you have any questions or you want to jump in so I can, if I missed any area.
Just so I understand, let me just try to repeat that a little bit in the way my mind is trying to frame that. So we always have some demand.
Yes.
And stress can come in many different ways, which will in theory increase that demand.
Yes.
And if our supply and availability or ability to create energy or generate it, cultivate it, whatever, is not sufficient to meet that demand, which is going to be heightened with a stressful input of some sort, whether it's emotional, mental, bacterial, thinkery, exercise, whatever, then then stress is essentially created and a shift, the beginning of a shift is taking place, which leads to some cascade that you'll, I guess, dive into.
Yeah. So you pretty much nailed it right on the head. You have the body has a general energy level and you have all these imposed demands. You're never going to stop having these energetic demands imposed, right? That's life in and of itself. But what you're seeing with stress is you have this circumstance where the energy demand is larger than what you're supplying at that point in time. So the body has systems to deal with this. Those are the adaptive hormones or the stress hormones that are often talked about. That's your cortisol, your glucagon, your adrenaline, and there's this whole cascade. And what these hormones are doing is they're liberating resources. Cortisol's breaking down glycogen, breaking down amino acids, turning that into glucose. Adrenaline's breaking down fat stores and liberating that so that you have this energy substrate that you can use to meet this demand. And then, and essentially that's their purpose, is to do that so that whatever the external demand is, you now have this substrate, this energy source, fat, carbs, proteins that you can use to meet that specific demand. But the problem comes in is that chronic upregulation of these things, or consistent upregulation of these things, or even upregulating these things because you don't have a solid energy production on a regular basis, starts to lead to issues down the road, because there's a cost every time you start to rely on these backup systems. So I don't know if that's clear, but that's kind of I'd say the first principle to think of, particularly in an audience that's geared around mindfulness and addressing stress and calming the nervous system and things along those lines. This first principle of managing stress and understanding it from an energy supply and energy demand perspective, and that there's a cost when the energy demand is overriding the supply and you have to use these backup systems. So the goal from the dietary perspective is to basically have this optimal supply so that when you have these external demands imposed upon you, you're ready to deal with those demands. That is that stress resilience. And it's also, from a longevity or health perspective, you're minimizing the negative impact of chronically having to run or upregulate these different hormonal processes that come at that cost.
Gotcha. And I want to get more deeply into the benefits and the challenges I've had so far. And maybe you could help walk me through some of the challenges. But probably the biggest benefit that stands out so far is that stress management component. I have a history of doing a lot of things to manage stress, whether it's breathing exercise, meditation, a warm bath, whatever the thing is.
Yeah.
And what I've noticed is they work usually in an acute situation, but it's a time. They all require time. Some of them require money, and I noticed that I need a lot less of that. The dietary changes that are using this model are not only have I been able to pinpoint the ability to, in an acute stress. Now, granted, I've really only done this with physical and mental stress a little bit, not deep embedded emotional trauma or whatever, but, stressful day, I worked a bunch straight, I'm a little underfed or over, just meeting the demands of my exercise routine. I've noticed that using these principles to my advantage has, in an acute situation, decreased that stress to a noticeable degree, where like I literally just feel calmer. And also, I think in general, the general stress, like the amount of times that I need to go to the well to use a breathing exercise, they've really reduced. Like
Yep.
it's been, and that's where it's been uh really dramatic. I feel like I'm chipping away at the chronic stress equation, and lowering that baseline of where I'm at, which makes the threshold to be in stress seem to be farther away. Like I could do a lot more before I've tipped the scale too far, and now I'm in a stressful environment or a situation. So those are two principles, I guess. Um, well, I guess that's two angles of one principle.
Yeah.
Um, what else would you say is meaningful to touch on, just to give like some basics, like a
Yes.
foundation?
So I guess another parallel principle, it goes hand in hand with this, but the general idea, and this is actually Dr. Pete's hypothesis overall, is that energy and structure are interdependent at every level. So, and this will apply to consciousness as well, and we can kind of dig into this. But essentially, what Dr. Pete is saying is that your structure, your cells, your tissues, they'll their functions and their components allow you to generate energy. And then the more energy that you generate, the more structure or complexity that the organism is able to maintain, right? So, and it works in an upward spiral. So you have this circumstance where you're generating a lot of energy, metabolic energy, not just like, there's a lot of things that go into that, but in a general sense, and we can specify it if you want, going into like the flow of glucose into the Krebs cycle and cell respiration and all that type of stuff. But in general sense, when the production of energy by your body, the ability to do that allows you to maintain these complex functions and structures. And as that energy increases, you can also, to a degree, increase those functions and that complexity overall and improve the bodily structure. But at the same time, as energy starts to decrease, you start to degrade that structure, you start to degrade those functions. And let me give an example so it's not so abstract. And we can put this in, I guess, in the context of consciousness and stress and mindfulness and things along those lines, and kind of tie it into what you're experiencing. So the way I kind of just will describe this to clients is, if you think of the body as a corporation, right, an organization, if the organization only has so many resources available at this one point in time, right? And so say the resources decrease that year, and this is income, this is money, and the marketing department is using a crap ton of this resource. Well, that's going to take away resources from other departments in that organization, or in a parallel to a body situation, other functions. So with this limited energy supply and then demands imposed in these other areas of that organization are going to suffer. So maybe accounting's not doing as well anymore. Maybe the HR department had to lay a few people off. And so on a parallel side in the body, if you aren't producing this adequate amount of energy, if you're in this situation where you're under eating, or you're not sleeping well, or you're exercising to a very heavy extent, or you're really drastically minimizing carbohydrates, well, for a while you may be able to sustain that because there are backup systems involved in the body to manage that. But at a certain point, that HR department and that accounting department, that could be your mind state, that could be your mood, that could be your anxiety, that could be depression, that could be fertility. You can see loss of libido, you can see changes in, if you're a woman, you can see changes in your cycle. Those things start to take a hit. Those things start to down regulate. You start to lose some of these higher order functions. Whereas on the flip side, if say this corporation or the body has adequate resources available, well, they can expand these different departments. They can improve these different departments. Maybe the marketing starts to become just instead of just billboards, you start to market in social media, you start to market in Facebook ads, whatever the deal is, you start to increase all these different functions. Well, you start to see the same thing when you adjust these things with your own body. So what you wind up seeing is, oh, maybe I don't have anxiety anymore. Maybe I'm more social. Maybe I'm more extroverted. Maybe these external things that used to be stressors to me aren't stressors anymore. Maybe I can work X number of hours and I don't need to take a bath and use red light and do mindfulness techniques, and I don't have problems sleeping anymore. Maybe my cycle is a bit more regulated. I'm not having really bad PMS or things along those lines. So you start to see the adjustments in these functions. The other thing that, at least for me, that is it's super important from like a cognitive perspective is if I'm well fed every day, I'm eating enough on a regular basis, I have this adequate amount of energy, my ability from a cognitive perspective to kind of step back from whatever my emotional situation is, or whatever my train of thought is, or my conscious stream is, I can step back from that, have a meta awareness of it, and decide whether I want to integrate and adjust and involve myself into that, or if I want to switch tracks. And so from a stress perspective, particularly, or from a mindfulness perspective, that is way easier to do when I'm well fed. If I'm in a circumstance where my blood sugar is low, I've undereaten, I haven't slept very well, I'm not really going to get into that. Like, it's much more difficult to really get into that function or to have that degree of awareness, because I'm just trying to get past this period, trying to get by with what I'm going to do. So as with these circumstances, you have this kind of 2-level area, right? You have this top down or this bottom up perspective where you're drastically trying to improve the physiology. And then you also have this top down perspective where you're using your actual higher level function and control your mind state to also adjust your physiology, because it does as well. Some of the major stressors that you'll see even in the research are like perceived stressors. So if you have an exam coming up, you're not in that exam, but the thought of that exam can trigger a stressor. But when you're in this state where your bottom is so solid, your foundation of health, your foundation of energy is so solid, you can kind of just, I have this exam. Okay, here's the plan. And okay, I'll be ready to go. And you can, instead of getting stuck on that one piece of information and ruminating on it and developing anxiety about it, you can move to a circumstance where you can let it go. Okay, I have this exam. These are the things I need to do. Okay, I'll just get them done. And so you get to this state, you have enough energy where these things become a bit more effortless and they're not as taxing as they once were. And so this is something for me, and I think it parallels your situation, Les, is that when I was low carb, keto, paleo, all these types of things, I felt that I like had this, I was developing anxieties and I was developing sleep issues, and I was not very resilient to these different pieces. And then as I started to integrate more carbohydrate in my diet, to adjust my diet to some extent, and to improve some of this foundational function, I went from a state, as an example, when I graduated college after doing low carb, I basically had to spend a couple months just doing nothing because I was so exhausted from school. My family went through a divorce. I was eating low carb. I was trying to over exercise, trying to be a power lifter, all this type of stuff. I crashed my system, had to just conk out to a situation where once I fixed that balance, I was able to, go work 50, 60 hours in the hospital, and then also work out, and then also, do the podcast stuff with Jay and work with clients. So my ability to handle these different stressors and these different the energy demands of my life drastically increased compared to the circumstance where I was minimizing my energy to a large extent, and basically any little stressor that would come in after I kind of crippled the system was just like a massive deal. Mm-hmm. And it could be even very small things would start to drastically impact me.
Yeah, I went through that too. Small things. Like I remember I dropped a mug off the island and I had this massive stress response, like of adrenaline. And it's like, that's not normal.
No.
Like you dropped a mug, clean it up, move on. It speaks to, you talk about this spiral, and it's fascinating. It's like, if you could create more energy, get more efficient with that, let's say remove interference of that, which we got into a little bit with Jay, you create more of this structure, and with that structure, you can harness more energy, so you have more resources. And even something as like letting go of a mental stress or an emotional thought, that is a that requires a resource to be able to objectively see, like, I'm stressed over this thing, I need to let this go. There's a resource that's required, that requires and demands energy to do that task, that we probably are not aware of. And then it goes in the other direction. If you're under energied and you're losing structure, you're losing that function, and the system, I guess, has to prioritize, like, what marketing department or HR is it going to divvy it out to?
Yep.
And I would assume that your system is going to prioritize the things that just keep you alive right now. So the things that it's going to be that are going to be missing out on are the things that might help you thrive more long term, or help you procreate down the road, things like that. It's what's going to keep you from dying today, and
Yep.
we'll worry about the other stuff later. And I guess that's what's shown. And it also shows is seen by what systems are prioritizing to use these carbohydrates as fuel, like the nervous system and the brain, these things that like are very fundamental to our existence and our ability to operate and function.
Yep.
They get all those resources first for a reason.
Yep. And those are also those higher order systems, right? So like when you look at different animals and whatnot, what the real thing that separates us from any degree of the other animals is those intelligent and executive functions. And they're also the most energy intensive. So the brain, I think, is some small, I forget the specific percent in terms of weight of the body, but it uses a drastic amount of the body's energy. So the two systems that you'll see that really use a ton of energy in the body are the gut and the brain. And so what I find with people coming out of low carb or keto, or even extreme exercise, or low calorie diets to lose weight, things along those lines, some of the major symptoms that I see are alterations in gut function, and then alterations in mood and executive function and thinking. And I think it's not a surprise that you see that, because they are so energy intensive, because they are some of those higher order functions. And because when you have these energetic systems, again, you're in a situation where you have to choose what you're gonna prioritize, and the body is gonna prioritize survival at the beginning. So even for a lot of women, something that you'll see is alterations in cycle and fertility as being one of the most sensitive areas in terms of going into low carb diets, or going into low calorie diets, or over exercising, or things along those lines. So yeah, it's the body does have a system of prioritization. It's going to prioritize survival now, and then those higher order functions, those down the road functions, those things are really going to suffer. And that's where you're going to see these symptoms. The other thing I just want to tack on here really quickly is that a lot of these adaptive hormones, cortisol, adrenaline, glucagon, side effects of those hormones are a lot of the symptoms that people experience on a regular basis. So I'll give you an example. If I was to give somebody a synthetic exogenous, or basically a non-body produced glucocorticoid or cortisol type drug, at certain levels, I can induce things like mania or anxiety or depression. So you can induce them through these things. And it's in certain studies, you're looking at people with PTSD. You're looking at circumstances where people have resistant depression or refractory depression. It's not responding to treatment. They will find higher levels of cortisol and lower levels of thyroid function and things along those lines, or lower level of testosterone in men. And you see these associations, and it kind of goes hand in hand with this general hypothesis of things where the upregulation of these hormones are coming at a cost. There are side effects to them, and they will lower these other more beneficial hormones or functions that you'd want to optimize. And the hormones in and of themselves are messengers or signals from the cells, or from this top-down regulation of the body, saying, hey, we have this energetic problem. We have this situation going on. let's lower our thyroid function. Let's lower our sex steroids, our testosterone, progesterone, et cetera. And then we're going to have to increase our glucocorticoids, our cortisol, our adrenaline, and things along those lines. So you have this whole stress system geared around energy production. And then at the same time, something to keep in mind is if you're in this chronic state of stress, your body, and you're relying on these adaptive hormones, your body gets into a situation where these adaptive hormones are pulling from your tissues. Adrenaline's liberating fat, cortisol's breaking down amino acids, glucagon's breaking down glycogen stores, and also the amino acids and turning that into glucose and providing this substrate. Well, that's coming from your own tissues. So, and that's that slow degradation of structure. So the body's very intelligent, and it basically, when it does this, it'll also adaptively downregulate metabolism. Because if I'm shredding through all my stores, if I have all my firewood and I'm burning through my firewood, I'm not going to heat every single fireplace in every room of my house to keep all of it warm. I'm going to move everybody into that central room and heat one fireplace, because I'm not going to make it through the winter with the firewood I have there if I keep this burn rate up. So there's this adaptive downregulation as well that's involved in those hormonal systems.
Yeah, the hormones seem to play such a big role in kind of running the show. I mean, the impression I get is, and that's, I guess, one of the reasons why a lot of people that just try to cut calories to lose weight, even if it works, it seems to be very temporary, because the body will adapt and say, we're starving, so we need to slow down. The thyroid modulates it, so it turns down. The adrenals say, don't worry, we're here, we'll help you out. We'll get some energy. We'll just have to tear down the walls, throw this material in the fireplace. But those walls are you.
Yep.
Your bone, your tissues. Like, it's not an ideal situation. And maybe there's some benefits for very short periods. Sometimes, I don't know, that'd probably be pretty hard to quantify, but even though that's a claim that is definitely out there in the health sphere, that there's value in that, but it does, like, I don't think you'll see that elsewhere in the animal kingdom, where, that's something that would be valued. Like, it takes work to keep the engine running. You don't want to intentionally shut it down. It's interesting when you mentioned the higher order function, and it reminds me of when I was in like the worst of it in my health journey, shortly after being diagnosed with Lyme disease and going on 3 weeks of doxycycline, which really wrecked my gut, and then supposedly like Lyme literate nutritionist saying I should go keto, which I think was poor advice. And then it led to all kinds of problems that really manifested in the skin, mostly like just head to toe eczema. Really like couldn't leave the house very easily level of eczema, really suffering. And during that time, my kids were, young teenagers.
Yep.
And talk about the higher order function, like that time where you need to be there for them. And then not just not being able to be there the way you want to be, but then all the shit that comes with that as a parent, whether it's like the shame and the guilt and the embarrassment that you're not even able to like do the things you want to do for them. And like, talk about a cascade or spiral, that, and I think a lot of people feel that. Like, I notice in my clients the way, and since improving my health, like my ability to parent has dramatically improved.
Yep.
Whether it's having the resources to read a book to learn how to do it better, or to be introspective and, self-observant, being more mindful, whatever it is, all those things require energy and resources. And I notice in a lot of my clients over the years that there's struggles that at the time I really wouldn't have connected to their food situation. Like, I would be able to spot, this is garbage food. Like, you can't have M&Ms for breakfast, or and think there won't be a cost to that. But then I'd hear them talk about their kid or something, and the way that they're talking about it, and I'm hearing it, like wondering, how does the kid interpret what they're saying. Like, because this person loves their child and wants what's best. But when you're not well resourced, you're not necessarily going to be as skilled at conveying your love for that child in a way that that child needs to hear it. So these
Yeah.
things could show up in all aspects of our life, that, and a lot of those, the areas that we just wouldn't really connect the dots.
Yeah. Yeah. And I actually have an example that plays out in my relationship with my fiance. And I think that this is where like you want to have both that bottom up and that top down optimized. So from a mindfulness awareness perspective, like a meta awareness around your internal function, what's going on in your body, and also having framing for that, I think you need to have that, or it's very helpful to have that in conjunction with also understanding what's going on a physiologic level. And let me give an example because I know it can be a bit abstract. So with my fiance, the other day I was on a podcast, and Jay and I went for like so many hours because we always wind up going over. It's just like it's how it always goes between us because our relationship and whatnot. But we went over for a long time, and then we had to go and do some errands together, my fiance and I didn't really get to eat very much. So I ate enough carbs and protein, but I was like kind of low on fat. So I started to feel that blood sugar dip. And we could talk about some of the specifics of organizing the diet and whatnot. And so I started to feel it. I wasn't really feeling good. And so I just told my fiance right away, I was like, look, my blood sugar is starting to drop now. We don't really have any food available. And I'm in that spot. So if I'm a little like testy, or I'm a little bit frustrated about things, like just know it's because of that. And then also, like, when I know that it's not this person said this to me, or the world is going to end, or whatever we're doing is like, it's just so stressful. It's like, no, right now, my context, my state is one where I've like my blood sugar started to dip a little bit. I haven't eaten enough today, and I'm starting to feel it. And so when I have that top down awareness, and I have the frame and understanding that this is a blood sugar problem, and this is not because my fiance is a terrible person, then it makes it much easier to let her know, and then to interact with her in a meaningful way, and also know that my actions and my thought processes are being dictated to some extent or influenced by my state, by my physiologic state. And it comes into, so the first point there is that if you have this framing and understanding that sometimes your frustration or your anger or whatnot could just be a blood sugar problem, or it could just be because you didn't sleep last night, and it's not these external things that we all tend to ascribe our frustrations to. We tend to see things as external, at least in my experience. You can correct me if I'm wrong or a different experience, but you have these problems that happen, and you want to ascribe your state to these other, how you're feeling to these other things, instead of recognizing that your internal state right now is picking on these things and making these things become more prevalent in that moment. And then if you adjust that state, it's like, oh, it doesn't matter anymore. It wasn't really as much of a problem that I thought. So there's that perspective. You understand its physiologic element, and you have this awareness of yourself, this mindfulness of your state and how you're feeling and your thought processes, then you can very easily manage that. And then that can help to improve your relationships with significant others, with kids. I don't have kids yet, so I'm just speaking from theory at this point, but we'll see how it goes. But you can use those understandings to drive those relationships. And then a second piece that really came out of this for me, and it was a huge realization, because I spent a lot of time like with philosophy of the mind, of thinking about that for a while, and like the mind possibly being separate from the body. And what I came to with these experiences was, my understanding was that my consciousness is a function, or is generated by my physiology. And so with that perspective in mind, it became easy to understand that, oh, changes in my physiology are going to affect my consciousness. And so that's where those couple points were really important for me in terms of understanding how I'm feeling, why I'm feeling different things, and then how I'm interacting with others.
Yeah, that sounds great. And it helps you respond in a more skillful way that aligns with, what the things you value, instead of just kind of react emotionally or whatever. And that's and that's a two-way road. I mean, the placebo effect is evidence that it's a two-way road.
Yep.
They have to control for it, in studies for a reason, because it's real. It works.
Yeah.
The mind is very powerful.
Yeah.
It's funny you mentioned I was low on fat that day. That's one thing that I never find myself capable of. I feel like that's the macronutrient. Now I'm used to eating a fairly fatty diet, and I'm trying to play as the carbs go up. I'm trying to reduce some of the fat, and that's one thing that is not doesn't come as easy for me with the things that I eat. Maybe we'll get into that a little later. I want to touch on one other thing first, and then maybe get into the application, like what I'm going through.
Okay.
So I mentioned when I was chatting with Jay that some of you will have questions. One of them might be, what about diabetes? And in fact, I think there was a comment on the interview about that, and talking about insulin resistance, and claiming that maybe some of the benefits I got actually from adding sugar were because I need to get that checked out. I'm probably insulin resistant. And I do blood work a couple times a year, and I've been very aware of what I'm eating for a long time, and so far no evidence of that. But you guys propose, like, and insulin resistance, I know, is super important, and it seems like it's playing a role in so many of the common pathologies that lead to our demise, really.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems like it exists on a spectrum along the way to those other problems, the other pathologies, whether it be diabetes or some neurological disorders. But it seems like it all starts with that stress. Like, you have stress, which then leads to insulin resistance. So you guys teach a different way to look at insulin resistance than what's out there. And I'm guilty of used to thinking, well, you just went to the well too much. Like, yeah, we have an infrastructure to use this sugar, but if you overdo it, it backfires. It's there to help you survive when food is variable, and it's this beautiful, elegant mechanism that will help you store fat when you don't know. And then I'm like, that doesn't make any sense, because I mean, with everything else, it's a use it or lose it. It's not like, oh, you overused your machine and now it's broken. Like,
Yeah.
of course, like, what? How did I get that? And then when hearing you guys frame this, it's it just makes a lot more sense. Could you I know this could be a huge topic, so maybe
Yeah.
we could do the Cliff Note version.
Okay.
But can you talk, because I know that's a common thing in people's mind. What about insulin resistance? Can you give a different perspective of how that emerges?
Yeah, so I'll try my best to be concise here. There's like a lot that goes into this, and it's a topic that I like to dig through and talk about.
Okay, well, you
And
can run with it however you want, man.
I'll try my best to keep it as concise as possible. So a couple things. I think the first idea of insulin resistance came out of this perspective where there's like a receptor down regulation, right? So like if you have all this insulin, then the cells will just get used to it and they won't really respond anymore. And so you see that with some neurotransmitters in the brain. Like if you take a ton of drugs that agonize the dopamine receptor or release tons of dopamine, you can get this down regulation in those dopamine receptors. But this is not necessarily comparable to what goes on with insulin. So I think it's also, so that's the first piece, is it that the idea that it's just you have all this insulin and that carbs are signaling insulin and then your cells just become resistant to it because it just happened too much isn't really reality. Like, that's not really bore out into the research very much. And it's not really comparable to the other model where because I've seen it compared to like this dopamine down regulation idea. So I want to kind of dispel that piece first. It doesn't work that way. And I'm going to try to get in a little bit to the mechanism. So the next piece is like, what is insulin actually doing for us? Like, why do we even have this hormone? What is it signaling for us? What's its importance? So there's, first things first is, inside your body, you have all your tissues can take up different substrates, right? And by substrates, I mean things that they can use to produce energy or other cellular components. So carbs and fats are the main ones that are really used for energy. Protein really isn't used for energy. And if it is used for energy, it's converted into carbohydrate. So, and that process is a bit of a dirty process. because it will produce different byproducts like ammonia that your body then has to detoxify. Now, our body is completely capable of doing that, but it also comes in an energetic demand to the liver, which is the main place that does that. So you're really not going to want to oxidize protein or run on protein to produce carbohydrates. Not really ideal in the long run. And there's some hormonal and metabolic consequences of doing that. So the next piece is the main two that you're left with are carbs or fat. And there's this situation in, well, I guess before I get to that, your body is going to be oxidizing both carbs and fats at all times. And it's not that every cell is oxidizing both. It's that different populations of cells are oxidizing different substrate, and different populations of cells specifically or in general will oxidize one substrate more than the other. So as an example, the central nervous system largely runs on carbohydrate. Now, in circumstances where you don't have adequate carbohydrate available, it is so important that your nervous system gets this, that your body will break down other tissues, including muscle and skin and all types of different protein heavy tissues, to supply that glucose to your central nervous system. And then it will prioritize ketones for the central nervous system in severe deficiencies of carbohydrate. And that's because the central nervous system will not run on fats. And ketones oxidize to some extent based on their structure, or they burned more like carbohydrate than they are like fats. So you have the central nervous system, which is very carbohydrate dependent. Now, the other tissues of the body are a little bit more flexible to some extent. You have like red blood cells need carbohydrates, and then some of the gonads need, and some of the glands need carbohydrate, and some of the organs, it's important for some of their function. But the body's a bit more flexible, so can it adjust up and down? But the central nervous system is really like, it needs carbohydrate. Like you're not going to get away without it. Your body will produce it even if you take zero carbohydrate in on a regular basis. So in these circumstances, the carbohydrates taking in the central nervous system, and some of these tissues are taking carbohydrate whether or not there's insulin present. So these tissues are not insulin dependent. On the flip side, you have tissues that actually require, or having insulin present further drives that carbohydrate into the tissue. So these are considered the insulin dependent tissues. That's going to be your muscle tissue, that's going to be your fat tissue, and it's also to some extent going to be your liver. And what winds up happening is when these other tissues are all these other ones that are specifically dependent on carbohydrate are going to be oxidizing carbohydrate all the time. When you take in this exogenous carbohydrate, that insulin is a signal. It's an anabolic signal, not just for fat tissue, but for tissues in general, to say, hey, boys, it's a party. We got all this. Who brought the beer, right? Like we got all this substrate available. And so insulin is saying, hey, insulin dependent tissues, you guys aren't necessarily as important as these other tissues that always need carbohydrate, but we have this overflow, not in the sense that you're eating too much, but we have enough to give you guys some too. So you upregulate insulin, and then insulin gives it to these other tissues. Your liver glycogen can be refilled. Your muscle glycogen can be refilled. You start to store some body fat, or you can move into body fat. Now, something to keep in mind is the carbohydrate itself doesn't even like the fructose idea doesn't like rapidly produce fat like is perpetuated in some of the spheres. The ability to actually produce fat from fructose is actually quite low, and it would take quite a while to build up a significant amount. So that's a separate issue in terms of like obesity or diabetes, and I'm going to get to that, I promise. So insulin's context is it's a signal that you have carbohydrate and that you're in this anabolic state. You have a lot of energetic substrate on board in the form of carbohydrate. Now, on the flip side with fats, the fats will usually for these other tissues wind up being the default kind of substrate when carbohydrate's not available. So it's kind of like a signal of like, if you're only running majorly on fats, you only have exogenous fats, that you don't really have a lot of substrate available. And the reason why is, even if you were fasting, your body is going to run largely on fats. And a lot of tissues are going to shift over to fatty acid oxidation. And this is to spare that carbohydrate for the central nervous system. So fats are more of a signal that like, hey, we don't have a lot of, we're not having a party here. Like we don't have a lot of this substrate, this carbohydrate substrate available. And so you're not getting that insulin signaling when you have a lot of fats. So this is just context for the difference between carbs and fat. And then also like, why do we have this insulin signaling? So that's kind of like the foundation I want to lay there really quick. Now, next piece with the fats is anytime you're under stress, if you're releasing cortisol, glucagon, adrenaline, you're releasing mostly fats, and then you're driving further fat oxidation. So the stress state is characterized by increased fat oxidation. And these states like diabetes are actually characterized by increased fat oxidation, impaired glucose oxidation, and decreased energy availability at the cell. And a lot of these stress hormones can drive that diabetic profile because they upregulate that fatty acid oxidation. And so the key piece that I'm going to get to now is that the cell, an individual cell, cannot oxidize carbs and fat at the same time. It has to oxidize one substrate. And the oxidation of fats will impair the actual oxidation or burning of carbohydrate. It'll stop the carbohydrate from coming into the cell. So when you're under stress or you're heavily oxidizing these fats, you won't oxidize carbohydrate effectively. And what winds up happening is you have two circumstances with this diabetic state, because the idea of diabetes, like, oh, you have high blood sugar, so it's a carbohydrate issue. And it's what I'm getting at too, is that this high blood sugar state is a function of this issue with oxidizing the glucose at the cell. And a lot of the cells are actually driving fat oxidation instead. The other thing that's going on is the liver is sensing this to some extent and is pushing out more and more carbohydrate. It has this glucagon is upregulated. Some of these stress hormones are upregulated, and it's pushing out more and more carbohydrate, even if you take carbohydrate in. So that's a dysfunction, because usually if you were going to take carbohydrate in, the liver would stop putting out carbohydrate. That glucagon production would be lowered. So you're in this weird state with diabetes or impaired glucose tolerance or insulin insensitivity. You're in this state where you have this carbohydrate available, but your ability to use that carbohydrate is impaired, and the body gets the sense that that's going on, and it's still putting out that carbohydrate from the liver. And so it's not necessarily a state driven by carbohydrate coming in and then just making signaling insulin and insulin not responding. It's this state where even with the insulin signaling present with the carbohydrate, you have these high insulin levels in states of diabetes, that it still can't drive that glucose into the cell because the cell is having dysfunction in terms of oxidizing the glucose. The whole insulin cascade gets affected. The ability to oxidize glucose all the way through the Krebs cycle gets affected. And the cells are really relying on fatty acid oxidation heavily in these states. And so you see that with the stress state, you see that with the diabetic state, you see that with starvation, you see that with fasting, that the fatty acid oxidation is all getting upregulated across these states. And then that fatty acid oxidation is what's driving this glucose intolerance, because these cells can only oxidize that singular substrate at one time. And so that's I don't know.
So is all that glucose, so glucose isn't being run through the system because the stress is sending fat through the system. The cell can't burn both at the same time or oxidize both at the same time. Where is that glucose? And is that already in the cell, or is it all floating in the blood? Like, can the cell store glucose inside, but not run it through the Krebs cycle?
So there's a couple things that can go on. There's a series of different pathways inside the cell where glucose can be converted, like the polyol pathway or these other pathways where glucose can get shunted. Glucose can also move through glycolysis, and I know it's a little biochemistry heavy, but glycolysis is a little separate from the cell respiration. So in glycolysis, you can move the glucose through glycolysis and also like a lactic acid fermentation type of deal, and use that glucose to produce lactate. And then you shuttle out the lactate, and then the liver goes and converts that lactate back to glucose. And so the problem with that though, is when you're running that system, you don't really produce that much ATP from that. You produce much less. I think it's like 2 or 4 ATP, which so an ATP being the energy molecule.
So that's wasteful.
Yes, it's a wasteful metabolism versus when a glucose molecule runs through the Krebs cycle, you get the ATP in the 30s. So you're in this situation where you have like this wasteful utilization of the carbohydrate or the shunting of carbohydrate to these different pathways instead of oxidizing it all the way through effectively. And then the cells are running or oxidizing those fatty acids. The other thing is the glucose can get converted to fat and put into storage in the form of triglycerides. So the body basically has this like whole level of dysregulation around using that glucose. And it's just kind of going in all these different places and being shunted into all these other places instead of really being effectively oxidized through the mitochondria, through the aerobic respiration and producing that ATP. So
are there other dangers with that? Like, is that what the Warburg effect is, when that sugar is in the cell but not getting into the mitochondria, and then it goes through glycolysis? I forget if it's in the presence, if it's aerobic or anaerobic.
It's aerobic. It's aerobic glycolysis.
And then you're creating, I guess, more lactic acid than is ideal, and that's an environment that I guess cancer thrives in.
Yeah, so you're in it. Cancer has a lot of weird metabolic defects, and they're not. It's not like defects in the sense that things are just not running the right way. So they'll take glucose and the cancer cells will just run it through glycolysis and lactate production, but it won't really run it through the actual Krebs cycle and then produce the ATP, or it will run it through the Krebs cycle, but it won't oxidize appropriately through the electron transport chain. And then it will use fats instead. And so it's in the cancer cell, you have like this series of deranged metabolic situations going on, that where it, instead of a normal situation where the cell would oxidize glucose all the way through, produce ATP, or in another circumstance, if it was fats, oxidize the fats through and produce the ATP. So there's that upregulation in that glycolysis and lactate can also be a signal or a primordial signal to some extent for the cell to shift towards rapid division. So some of these metabolic defects going on, and I know now we're kind of like in a tangential area, but the metabolic defects going on in the cancer cell can actually be signals to lead to this rapid cell division. And then also, if you have a lot of this damage going on in the cell with the different metabolic defects going on, that can lead to further mutations in the DNA, the mitochondrial DNA, the cellular DNA, and alter what's going on in the cancer cell as well. So like a lot of cancer is driven by these metabolic problems. Oh, the diabetes or even obesity can be driven by these metabolic are driven by these metabolic problems directly.
It's funny, in the fitness world, there's some people out there that, and you don't hear this message a lot, but they really push like avoiding glycolytic based fitness activities, just to like that it's it's stressful, it's not good, it's not great for you, even though some fitness modalities live in that world. So to stay with let me see if I figure this out. So you're not good at you can't use the sugar and the fat at the same time in the cell.
Yes.
You're in a stress state, so you're sending fat because the stress state has these hormones that get your liver or other structures to liberate fat to get more energy because you are stressed.
Yeah.
But because the fatty acids are flowing, you can't use the glucose. The glucose builds up, but your liver is trying to fix it by partitioning more glucose, so when you see the blood sugar go up, it's not necessarily the donut, it's your own body trying to fix the problem and by getting more energy out there, because you're not doing a good job at using the potential energy that's already floating around.
So it's actually, because I work with quite a few clients who have diabetes, and what you actually see is that their baseline blood sugars are generally higher. So their fasting blood sugars could be like 150, 180. And then when they eat carbohydrate, their blood sugar will go up to, say they're at 160, maybe they'll go up to 190, and then it will come back down to a normal level, or well, not to a normal level, to their baseline, to that 150 mark. So what's happening is they have this underlying increased glucose output, and that's the liver putting out glucose through the signals of glucagon and adrenaline and cortisol, but mainly glucagon is the main signal driving this. And so their baseline blood sugar is higher. And then when they eat, they're going up and coming down, but they're just going back down to that initial baseline. So there's two features of the diabetic or impaired glucose tolerance state. You have this situation where you have this elevated glucagon that's constantly putting out this blood sugar, and it's not stopping or responding to the insulin that you're getting with the carbohydrate consumption. So, and then on the second side is you have this impaired ability at the cellular level to effectively utilize or take up that glucose. And so in these circumstances, what if in some of the research, if you actually block glucagon, you can improve many of the features of diabetes in and of itself. So just and they do this in rats, they basically knock out glucagon receptors. It's a lot of genetic, like special rats that they create to knock out these different things. But if you knock out the glucagon receptors, you can basically, and they do it through they give the rats a virus that will silence the glucagon receptors in their cells. And then essentially what happens is their features of diabetes are drastically downregulated. Like their blood sugars improve, their insulin sensitivity improves, etc. So the diabetic state is characterized by these two things. And the high blood sugar and things that people are seeing in these states isn't just because you're eating that carbohydrate and it's just like it's driving the blood sugar up. Is you have this underlying baseline production going on, and then you have an issue with that carbohydrate disposal. So the question in terms of fixing it is, how do you adjust what's going on at the cell? How do you kind of bring that excess fatty acid oxidation at the cells down? How do you improve that ATP production going on at the cells? How do you minimize that glucagon production at the liver so that your body can now get into a state where you're actually taking the carbohydrate and you're oxidizing it, and the signals are improving so that when you get this insulin signal, that glucagon starts to come down. So it's more than just this idea that carbs are driving insulin and then insulin is driving this problem. It's more of a problem of there's an issue going on at the cells in terms of oxidation of substrate, particularly carbohydrate. And then there's an issue going on at the liver in terms of excess glucagon upregulation and pushing out of carbohydrate that's not responding to insulin. So it's like this whole kind of derangement, and it's not as simple as just eating carbohydrate causes that problem.
Right.
There's many things that are involved with that, and that's where, if you talked with some of Jay about some of the metabolic inhibitors to the system, that's where you can kind of see some of those things going on. I don't know if you talked about like gut situations like endotoxin or the polyunsaturated fats.
We did
things
briefly.
along those lines.
Yeah, we did briefly, but I wouldn't mind getting more into that. So the glucagon is something really to focus on then, because it's what is triggering the glucagon that raises the base level. And that could be any one of those stresses, endogenous stresses, life stresses, or anything interfering with our ability to oxidize the glucose.
Yeah, and so this is like one of the arguments that Jay and I we have a podcast episode in response to one of the paleo advocates, Rob Wolf, and what we were talking about. Rob Wolf was saying that in like a keto or low carb diet, you see this constant blood sugar, and that constant blood sugar is a function of just running on these adaptive hormones all the time, because you're not eating carbohydrate, bringing your blood sugar up, and then insulin is helping you to dispose of that carbohydrate into the different tissues, and then the different tissues are using it. You're just running glucagon, your liver's putting out that carbohydrate, and then your cells are like, it's matched with your cells uptake. But again, you're still resting on those adaptive hormones. You're still resting on that glucagon to maintain that blood sugar.
So you're stressed at base level, basically.
Exactly. That was kind of our argument, because essentially what you see over time with low carb, keto, carnivore diets is that people's fasting blood sugars will tend to start to creep up. And so you'll see people with their fasting blood sugars maybe in the low 100s, maybe 110 when they're on keto and carnivore. And like, how is this happening? if I'm not eating any carbohydrate. And it's because that base level of glucagon and glucose output from the liver or response to the glucagon is being adjusted and adaptively upregulated. And then when they come to bioenergetic, if they implement things, it can be a little tricky with the implementation when you're starting to switch over. But when they start to implement things like, oh, my fasting blood sugar dropped, but now I'm eating like 200 grams of carbs a day, what's going on? And it's that insulin signaling that you now have, where you eat the carbohydrate, comes up, insulin signals, starts to bring that glucagon back down. And then obviously, when you start to increase carbohydrate in your diet, you will start to increase your oxidation of carbohydrate, as long as you don't have that actual issue at the cell. Now, something I do want to talk about is that ketosis, low carb, all of these different states, particularly ketosis, are characterized by insulin resistance. So when it's a physiologic insulin resistance. And by physiologic, I mean, it's not like you're not diabetic, you don't have this pathology or this disease process, but you're in a state where you're actually, because you're oxidizing so much fats and the cells can only run on or use one substrate at a time, that you're not very good at using glucose in those states. And there is a period of time, if you are transitioning from low carb to increasing carbs in your diet, where your metabolic machinery and the hormonal systems have to adjust to that. So it can, like, because I have a lot of people who are like, I'm on carnivore, I'm on keto, I did paleo, I did low carb, and I felt better, I lost some weight, but now my weight is stalling and my sleep is kind of bad and I'm getting some anxiety, or my cycle kind of got messed up, or my testosterone is lower, or my cholesterol, and for some people's like in the 400s, like, what do I do? And then I found Repeat, I found your guys' podcast, and I started like eating carbs. And man, the first time I did it, like I felt better, like I felt less stressed, but I was a little dizzy. I was kind of like a little bit off. And there is an adjustment period to like from focusing mainly on oxidizing fat to starting to increase your carb oxidation. And in the research studies, you can kind of see this where there's something called the respiratory quotient. And basically, they're looking at the ratio to CO2 production and oxygen consumption. And you can see that as you increase carbohydrate intake or you increase fat intake, you will adjust that respiratory quotient. And that's basically indicating whether you're oxidizing more carbs or more fats. And the reason that is because when you oxidize carbs, you produce more CO2 in relation to oxygen. And when you oxidize fats, you'll consume more oxygen and produce less CO2. So you can use those things as proxy markers to determine what's going on metabolically. And so you'll see people, they go to a mostly carbohydrate diet, that quotient will adjust and reflect that, as long as there's not significant metabolic dysfunction. And then when you see people on a high fat diet, you'll see that that will also adjust as well. And there's a transition period where your body is adjusting to these different things, because you are really hammering home different pathways. If you're running mostly on fat, you're going to drive adrenaline, you're going to drive glucagon. If you're running on carbohydrate, you're going to start to have that insulin signaling. And so you have to keep that in mind if you are transitioning between these different diets.
Gotcha. Yeah, now let's get into that now. You mentioned it's tricky. And actually, before you mentioned the carbon dioxide, and that's how they measure whether you're oxidizing that quotient that represents how much carbon dioxide you're producing. For the listeners, when we had Jay on recently, we double clicked that a little bit, and just to recognize the value of that. And a lot of the breath work practices that exist are literally to increase carbon dioxide. And I know that I've gotten some benefits, I think, from that increased carbon dioxide production. Most noticeably is like this like air hunger sensation I would get periodically seems to just be gone now.
Yeah.
And that sensation is not a pleasant sensation. And I could fix it, but it would be like a 20 or 30 minute breathwork session. Whereas now it's just not there.
Yeah.
So speaking of tricky, I've been a couple months in, probably between 2 and 3 months of significantly increasing carbohydrate. Now I've increased, so I was for a while, I was super low carb because I didn't even know that you could eat 150 grams of carbs and still be considered low carb.
Yeah.
So I was in no man's land for like a good while where you're not in ketosis, maybe periodically dipping a little bit, but not really in ketosis, but not even having enough carbs to like run your nervous system for a day, let alone everything else. So, this 75 to 100 grams a day, there's no man's land, which is stressful. Now I know that is stressful. So I've been increasing fruits, dried fruit, honey, maple syrup. I was already doing the raw milk thing. So the 75 to 100 grams of carbs I was having was generally in the form of a little bit of fruit, a little bit of honey, a medium amount of raw dairy, and that was it.
Yeah.
I probably pieced together an occasional starch with dinner occasionally, but and that didn't work. So I've been increasing the fruit, adding dry fruit, which I've really learned to enjoy. Things that even dry fruit, like that's something I would have vilified and like got on someone's case for a year ago. And a little bit more starch, like mostly in the form of white rice, and a little bit of, I've been making my own like slow fermented sourdough bread. We had Bill Schindler on the podcast, who teaches kind of old school traditions of preparing
The
food
grains
in
and
a
whatnot.
modern way, which is great, fantastic resource. And so I've been baking like one loaf of bread a week that the family shares. And I would say, unless I eat too much of it, I seem to be handling that really well, even though for years, like bread was obviously problematic for me. I got negative responses from it. So that's where I'm at. So, and I'm eating cane sugar. And honestly, I think I have this, I get the big bag of organic cane sugar. I think that's the thing that serves me the best.
Okay.
And I'm wondering because like, it's just instant energy. It's rocket fuel. I don't have to deal with my gut having to deal with it. I don't have to worry about whether my colon can handle the fiber. And I get some funny looks in the house, because I will literally put a spoon into a bowl of sugar and put it in my mouth. And I'm putting 2 heaping tablespoons of that sugar in my coffee in the morning.
Yep.
Along with 2 tablespoons of Amish country raw cream, like cream so thick you got to scoop it. It doesn't pour. It's glorious. Not the cheapest stuff, but so it's going really well. My energy, great. Air hunger, gone. General stress level, lower. And also ability to manage more acute stress, whether it be through exercise or just evening anxiety, thinking about the world kind of stress. I could shut that down in a few minutes with a teaspoon or tablespoon of sugar. So all in all, good. My workouts, man, I have so much. I'm 45. I'm going to be 46 this year. I think, yeah, 46. And I'm just killing it in the gym. Like I have gears that I did not have before. Like I would go, my big workouts are usually fairly long, and I would go like an hour and a half. In the last 20 minutes, I'd be on like fumes. Now I'm going 2 hours and I'm just like, you have to go home, Les. Leave the gym, go home. And I'm like, I could definitely do more. I feel like my muscles aren't getting depleted. So I'll have, I had the local health food store has this dried pineapple that's like coated in sugar. Organic pineapple, literally dipped in sugar. And I'll bring one of these discs, with me, and I'll just nibble on it through my workout. Yep. Which I always try to used to like work out fasted. And now I'm like, no, feed the system, the more, the better. And my workouts are so productive. Now the downfall, I wanted to get some insight. Maybe I'm going too fast. I have a tough time modulating myself. Maybe when I've been known to like, well, this works, so let's do more.
Yeah.
This supplement seemed to do something. What does a quadruple dose do? Which, blessing and a curse. Sometimes that goes really well. So some bumps along the road. I wanted to get your insights.
Okay.
I wrote these down. So I definitely gained a little weight.
Yep.
I mean, and just for some context, I used to be like just shy 240 pounds, all fat. Started exercising, leveled off. I was racing triathlons in like the mid 2000s at like 185, 190,
Mm-hmm.
which is a fat triathlete basically at
Yeah.
5'11. I was very dangerous over short distances. And then but lugging all that weight up a big hill is a problem. So then slowly as I went low carb, I got lighter. And when I got sick and I was doing all these elimination diets, trying to heal my gut and get better and tinkering with different fasting strategies, I got really light. I got down to 153. So I went from
Okay.
like 237. And then in spring of 18, I was 153.
Okay.
And then I leveled off. So 19, 20, 21, I was probably between 175 and 182 ish. And I thought that was a reasonable weight for me, but I
Okay.
was stressed. And I thought that was good. So I just assumed any heavier would be probably not good because that'd be excess weight. Excess is bad, right? So then I introduced this. Immediately I gain what's obviously water weight because I know you can't gain 10 pounds of fat and protein in a week.
Yep.
And Jay educated us that, when you're storing carbohydrates, you store 3 times their weight in water.
Yep.
Which what I find is a good thing because I'm, by another benefit, way more hydrated. I don't have to tinker with all the, you mentioned Rob Wolf. He makes a
Mm-hmm.
great product, Element.
Yep.
And I'll still use it if I'm like getting in the sauna, if I'm doing
Mm-hmm.
like a significant sweat. But like I used to use a lot of that stuff, and all the electrolyte powders I don't really need anymore. I
Yep.
feel like I'm holding on to water, and that's good. But I think there might be a little extra weight, so I don't know if I'm throwing too much fuel on the system and my machinery's not there yet, and
Okay.
it can't catch up. So maybe I'm going too fast. Uh, it almost feels like sometimes there's a little bit of a bloat, but it almost feels like not like a gaseous bloat, but more of like as if I drank a bunch of water that's just sitting in my belly, but I didn't drink a bunch of water. So
Okay.
I don't know what to make of that. Um, Not a real problem, but I'm trying not to like interpret these things yet. Just be like, oh, look at this. I'm experiencing this, not freaking out. And then a little bit of heartburn. And this is the one that's a little uncomfortable. So that's not something I've had to deal with. I remember back before I got into like wellness, 15 plus years ago, if I had like a big dish of pasta or pizza, I might occasionally get heartburn, but I really haven't had any heartburn in like 15 years.
Yep.
And and I am drinking juices. I have a feeling that some of the juices might be contributing to the heartburn.
Okay.
I don't know if like maybe that's good, but not for me or not yet. So those are like the challenges I'm trying to navigate, and would love, some expert advice of, how do I hold space for these, not beat myself up, and navigate forward with skill.
Okay. So just to clarify, so we have heartburn, weight gain, a little bit of bloating, and then what did I miss anything?
No, and the weight gain, I'm like 205 now for perspective. So 205, I feel like I've leveled off at 205,
Okay.
which a year ago I would have said that's got to be terrible, but it feels good.
Okay.
Like 205 feels good.
And before you started adding all the carbs in, where were you at again? What was your starting weight?
Probably around 180 to 180, 182, low 180s.
Okay. So 180.
So I put on 20 to 25 pounds in a year of first slowly ramping up carbs.
Okay.
And then more recently, after hearing you guys, really ramping up.
Okay. I'm just gonna. I took a little list here so I can make sure I stay on track and I can answer your questions appropriately.
Okay.
So I guess first things first, as far as let's tackle weight gain, right? Because that's going to be the big one that everybody wants to know about. Am I gonna, if I add a glass of 8 ounces of orange juice to my eggs and kale breakfast, am I gonna just balloon, right? So that would be, I guess, the first question for people. So when you first start to transition over, the first piece is that when you start to increase carbs, as you mentioned, you will, or as Jay discussed, you will bring water weight on board, because the glycogen and carbohydrate are stored with that water. So the 3-to-1 ratio is indeed correct. Yeah, Jay and I have covered this on videos together, so we're coming from the same place. So you're going to hold some water. If you're gaining, depending on your size and how much muscle you're holding and all that type of stuff, you're working out, etc., I would say it'd probably be, for like a larger guy, probably a fluctuation of 10 pounds would be about normal. And then I would say after that, you're probably starting to gain weight. Now, in your circumstance, you're lifting, so there's a good chance that you're probably putting on some muscle, but also putting on some body fat simultaneously. And so that's the first piece, is that you can gain water weight. If you're larger, like a larger guy, maybe up to 10 pounds, I would say is kind of okay. And it will come on fast. So it's like the same thing with keto. If you go keto, most people are like, oh, I lost 10 pounds in the first 2 weeks. It's like, that's not fat.
Right.
That's because you've depleted your carbohydrate stores, and now you've lost some water, and maybe you lost a little bit of the water weight fluff that people tend to hold. And that's like the same deal that you see at the end of the day, where you're like, oh, I'm holding a little more. And then when you wake up in the morning, you're super lean. It's that kind of deal. So in that circumstance, it's kind of normal. Now, what I want to touch on with the bioenergetic pieces, there's a couple things. So the first thing is that if you lost a lot of body weight, like pretty quickly, or you've been on the lower body weight side for a period of time, and you've been running probably either carbohydrate deficit or a caloric deficit to some extent, and you've also been training and you've been digging into those stress hormones, you can get into a state where when you start to eat again and you start to regain body weight, there's actually this is like in the research type of thing. There's a term, one of them is post-starvation obesity. And then there's like other terms that they talk about inside the research in terms of like this, like overshooting of fat gain when reclaiming body mass. And so what they're looking at here is they're not looking at like people who are keto and doing 6-day-a-week bodybuilding workouts. Some of the things they're looking at is like the Minnesota starvation experiment, or they're looking at Army Ranger training, where they had these young guys, probably in their 20s, maybe their teens. They put them through these rigorous, like low calorie, plus this like psychological stress and or physical stress training. And so they wound up losing body mass in that period of time. And when they come back from that, they wind up being in a circumstance where they've gained at least 10 pounds of fat directly. And it's not even like eating necessarily in a massive caloric excess, but they come back to eating normal again. And what happens is when you dig into these pathways and you dig into these hormones, you downregulate thyroid function, you downregulate androgenic signaling to some extent, and you downregulate leptin signaling. A whole host of these hormones get downregulated. And then the cortisol, glucocorticoids, adrenaline, which is part of the catecholamines, glucagon, all these things kind of get increased. And then in this circumstance, there's also things that goes on with the cells, where the cells adjust their energy output. So now this adaptive thermogenesis, this ability to produce heat from your food, kind of gets down regulated as well. So you come back in this bit of a lowered metabolic state. And what winds up happening is, as your body mass, your actual lean tissue, is starting to come back to normal, your rate of fat mass is actually higher. So you wind up putting on some fat mass. If you're coming from these states where you're low carb, maybe a little bit on the lower calorie side, maybe eating once or twice a day, still exercising, maybe running marathons, maybe you lost over 100 pounds of body weight. So you basically will find yourself primed in this circumstance to put on a bit of body fat. And this is known like in the literature for even athletes like gymnasts and
Is that protective, you think? Is that like your body saying, don't do that to me again, I'm going to store extra energy in long-term facilities, adipose tissue?
I
Or
think it is. I think it's probably a protective or an adaptive survival mechanism, so that when you do go through subsequent stressors like that, you're basically sending a signal to your body like, hey, the environment is X, Y, and Z. It's not that great. And so I think in the future, your body puts on a little bit of extra storage in case you have to go through that circumstance again, that like extreme famine cycle to some extent. And so, yeah, and those training period that I mentioned with the Rangers wasn't like, it wasn't years. It was like a couple weeks type of thing. So even in the short term, when you say like, oh, I gotta get super lean for my wedding, I'm gonna go on this ridiculous low calorie diet, and I'm gonna do cardio every morning, and my carbs are gonna be 20 and all this type of stuff. When you do rebound from that, there is a chance that you can put on some more body fat from that, especially if you've done it over a couple of weeks. So those fasting and feeding cycles can be a bit damaging to the hormones, and then also can set you up to gain weight. And this is known in the research. It's like a known phenomena.
does that
So,
level out? Do I need to just be more patient?
so from this context, what I usually do when you do like a controlled reverse diet type of situation. So if I have a client who comes to me, they found the bioenergetic stuff, they're scared to introduce carbs, but they're not doing well on low carb, and they've tried some and they feel a little bit better, but they don't want to gain weight, I will slowly adjust and taper their carbs up appropriately to their tolerance, so that this is a consistent phase. The next thing we talk about is the types of carbs and foods that I'm having them put on board. I'll adjust as well and use specific ones that can help to mitigate some of the stress hormones, mitigate some of the fat gain. And then
So go slow, which seems sensible, which is not what
yes.
I did.
Well, the other problem when you come out of these famine, let's call it the famine stage just to keep it easy. When you come out of this like famine stage, is that you will get a degree of hyperphagia, or you will just be really hungry. So as a personal example for both Jay and I, when we were in college, so we're young, we're in our 20s, we came out of low carb, cyclical keto, fasting on top of like this crazy power building, which was like a mix of bodybuilding and powerlifting and gymnastic training. And we were eating enough calories to some extent. Maybe on a couple days a week, we were on the lower end for what we were actually doing, but we were like voracious. I remember you're saying you took 2 tablespoons of sugar out of a bowl. I would just sit there on the couch with a bag of granulated sugar and just eat that. I was eating everything in sight. Whole Foods used to sell these banana chips, which was like bananas fried in coconut oil with a little bit of sugar on them. I would eat the whole bag in one sitting. It was uncontrollable hunger. And we also experienced that while we were low carb. And I was kind of the bad one, because it'd be like Saturday and Sunday, and we did like a fasting 2 days of that week, and we worked out 5 days, and then we also did keto 2 days, and on some of our heavier workout days we refed carbs, but only up to 200 grams, so like things like that. And so on the weekend we would sit down and we'd be in the house, we're like, oh, we're gonna go out tonight, we're gonna do this, we're gonna do that. And so Jay we had this like 5-pound bag of blueberries in the refrigerator, and we sat on the couch and we just ate the whole bag. We just literally ate the 5-pound bag of blueberries, and we didn't go out because we stained our hands and faces purple. But we would do things like that, and because it's that you have that response to this, like to what you have to this famine stage. So it's kind of normal for people to come off it and be like, oh, I'm just going to eat everything now. And it's also, there's a psychology to it where it's like in the low carb and whatnot, there's a lot of restricting around foods, right? Because you start with low carb and paleo, and then you go lower carb, and then you go keto, and then you go carnivore. And so I have people that I work with are coming like, yeah, I've been eating 3 pounds of steak a day for the past year, and that's it. And then it's like, now it's like, oh, I can have orange juice, I can have all these different types of foods. And so there's that psychology element as well, where it's like the gates have been opened.
Yeah.
And you're feeling better, and your appetite is like a lot higher. And then you also have all this freedom now that you didn't have before. So those things play into that situation as well. But generally a slow increase in calories and a slow increase in carbohydrate, and choosing your carbohydrate sources appropriately is important. Now, the next piece, And I want to come back to that. Go ahead.
Can you just say, like, when you say slow, what is slow? Like adding a certain percentage every week?
Yep. So there's a couple targets to look at, and it also depends on the individual. Like, a lot of this is where that context comes in. That's important. So I'll give you an example. Say we were working together. Say you're my client, and I'm gonna try to, you're coming out of this low carb. What are we gonna do? You want to increase carbs. You're feeling better, but you're worried about the weight gain. First things first, we're gonna sit down. We're gonna see what is, based on your activity level, based on your size, what is like a reasonable caloric intake. And it's not that calories in, calories out, or the be all to end all. I just want to get a sense based on the research of what would be considered a normal food volume. And that's all the calories really tell us, right? So we're going to see what's this normal food volume. Then from there, we'll say in your circumstances, 3,000 calories a day. You're a bigger guy, you have a decent amount of muscle mass, you work out regularly. So we're going to see, where are you meeting? Where are you hitting currently? Most people that come out of these diets, I'll have guys who are about the same size, and they're like, oh yeah, I'm eating 2,400 calories a day. And so they're already technically in a deficit. They're already in like a 600 calorie deficit if we're using 3,000 as like, this is where they technically should be. So the first things first is I will want to get them to 3,000. So that's point number one. And even just increasing calories, people will feel better overall, even if I don't drastically increase your carbohydrate. But just eating enough to support what you're doing is important from the get-go. So that's foundational step number one. Number two is we're going to look at, what are you doing? We're going to look at protein amounts. Are you eating, how much protein do we want you to eat based on the research? So we're going to solidify that, and we're going to keep that standard over time. We want to make sure you're eating enough protein to sustain your lean mass, to build more tissue, more muscle tissue, and not really use that protein for energy, because as I discussed it, there's problems with doing that. So we'll have that piece kind of standard. And then what we'll do is the first level of carbohydrate or the target that we'll initially shoot for is 2 times as much of that protein in the form of carbohydrate. So say for you, your protein requirement's about 50 grams or 150 grams, excuse me. We'll probably shoot for 300. Now, I'm not going to take you from, 50 grams of carbohydrate to 300 grams of carbohydrate tomorrow, the next day, the next week, the next 2 weeks, or anything along those lines. What I would slowly do, first, I want to get you to 150 grams. That's the baseline minimum amount that you're going to require for like the central nervous system function on a regular basis. And then it could even be higher depending on your size and other factors that you have going on. So that's where Jay and I usually kind of agree on, like, that 200 gram mark is probably the minimum that we really want people to be at. But again, we're not going to bring you there right away if you've been on that 50 grams, right? That's a 4 times increase in one go. So it's a slow taper up. So I'll probably, if you're sitting at the 50, I'll probably try to bring you to 100, 150 at first and see how you tolerate that. If it's too much, we'll taper back a little bit. And then from there, we'll increase. And the way I do this is I will adjust the amounts at each meal. So say you're at 150 grams of carbs per day, and you're doing 3 meals a day. We'll do 50 grams per meal. And then say we want to get to that 300 gram level, I'll just bring you up by 10 grams per meal or 25 grams per meal or something like that. And I'll adjust the rate based on how you're responding. Some people respond really well and it goes up fast and it's like, whoa, I feel so much better.
What's typical though? Like if somebody's going, in my case, for instance, let's say I was getting 100 and I want to get to 300.
Yeah.
How long should I give myself to go from 100 to 300 to do it in an intelligent way? Which if it's up to me, I'm guaranteed to do it in a dumb way.
Okay. It's hard to give you like an exact time, but just, I would maybe try to increase by, I don't know, 20 grams, 25 grams per meal per week or something like that.
Okay. So okay. Gotcha.
So you could do so say you're at 50 grams per meal this week. The next week after that, maybe you go to 75 grams per meal. And I would say the caveat here, and this is, I guess, why it's the bioenergetic point of view can be a bit difficult, is because there's caveat and nuance and these different elements, and people are like, just what is the amount that I need to do? Yeah, exactly. Stop beating around the bush. But if you're not feeling very well, or you're getting a little dizzy or things like that, give it a couple days. allow yourself to kind of push through, see if that adjusts. And if you're still not feeling that great, then I would scale back a little bit. Because it does take some, especially if the longer you've been doing that and you've been driving those pathways, the harder it can be sometimes for different people. And if you have any type of metabolic dysfunction, like a lot of the clients that I work with are type 2 diabetic, and they're coming off keto, which didn't fix their type 2 diabetes. It just kind of didn't have them have blood glucose spikes super high anymore. So, but they still are like type 2 diabetic, like, and some markers improved, but then they were staying there and sometimes it was getting worse. So they were like, okay, this is not working anymore, so I want to adjust. So in those circumstances, I really it's a slow process, and I use that 150, 200 grams. And then depending on what their targets are from there and their activity levels, we'll adjust from there. Now, there's a caveat, or not a caveat, but something very important to consider when you're doing this. And this is a problem I see pretty consistently. When people want to increase carbohydrates in their diet and they're coming off lower carb and they're used to eating volumes of fat on a regular basis, you can't still keep your fat massively high and then try to, like, you don't want to do 60 grams of fat in a meal plus 100 grams of carbs, because that is a recipe to start putting on tons of weight. Because even from like a sheer food volume, like a caloric volume, it's going to be very high. So you're going to have to start to bring that fat content down.
I think that's where I might speak to my problem, actually, because I will take a piece of cheese out and put honey on it, or I'll put what would most people would say an unreasonable amount of butter on a piece of sourdough toast.
Yeah. So that's something that will start to cause the weight gain, is if you're still running 200 grams of fat a day and then you just threw 300 grams of carbs on top. There's, while calories in, there's like modulation, or there's like, we could talk about like the calories in, calories out idea and how it applies to obesity a bit if you want, because it applies here to some extent. It's not that calories in, calories out are like the be all to end all, but there is at a certain point, like if you're going to eat like 4,000 calories or 3,500 calories a day, and you're really only using about 2,500, your body's not just going to automatically, I'm going to burn an extra 1,000.
Right.
It's physiologic. It's normal to store body fat. I don't think this is the underlying cause of obesity. And because your body, if you overfeed, you start to increase metabolism to some extent. And then there's also, at a certain point, you're going to be too full or bloated, or you'll get satiety mechanisms. Someone can just be like, oh, I need to chill out. So those things will kick in, but you can put on an excess amount of body fat, not to an obesity scale, but to like, I'm holding a little more than I want type of scale. If you just maintain this super high intake perpetually, and you're not really adjusting these things to some extent. So that's an important piece.
Let me ask you your opinion of this strategy then, because I eat a whole food diet. I mean, I'm eating pastured meats, raw dairies, the honey, maple syrup, and fruit.
Yep.
And a little bit of sourdough bread. Little bit of fish and chicken. I minimize those. It's mostly, pastured red meat from regenerative agricultural farms.
Yep.
I am used to eating fairly fatty cuts of meat. I think I love them. And other than like the butter I'm putting on things or the little bit of fat I'm using to cook something, I guess the easiest way to lower the fat would be just to get leaner meats, leaner cuts, because I don't know where else I could reduce it. Like, most of the fat I'm getting is in the meat that I'm eating.
Yep.
So I feel like that is probably the easiest lever to tinker with, but I've been so accustomed to getting the fatty cuts coming from a higher fat lifestyle.
So there's a couple things with that. So let's talk about fat specifically now, because we did the carbs a little bit. With fat, usually, and it depends on the person, depends on muscle mass, depends on training, all that type of stuff. The range for what will work for people can be anywhere as low as 20% of calories all the way up to 40% from what I've seen. If you go too low fat, you will start to develop other problems. So your blood sugar can be kind of all over the place because you're eating the carbs, the fat's not helping you stabilize it, and then boom, your sugar drops and you're hungry again. So you can have that. You can start to get digestive issues if your fat goes too low, because the fat stimulates the bile acid release. It also stimulates digestive enzyme release. So that's really important. And then the fat is also a base for that hormonal function, those steroid hormones. If you lower fat too much, you can see that, for example, in some of the studies, testosterone can start to drop in men. What I've seen in clients is not necessarily like, I've seen testosterone levels drop, but I've also seen like the function change. So I've seen women have more dysregulation with their cycle if they're too low fat. I've seen libido be poor. I've seen guys' mental function be poor. They're kind of brain foggy, or their drive in the gym is poor. They're just not doing that good in their workouts anymore. So the other thing to keep in mind is your body, your muscles specifically, are oxidizing that fat at rest. So if you are a larger guy, if you're holding a decent amount of muscle, you may want to have a bit more fat on board to like feel good in general.
Like I don't know how to put together a diet where I'm not closer to the 40 than the 20.
Yeah. So on the flip side, too much fat, you can start to gain weight if you're doing that plus really high carbs. So that's the issue. And then on the other perspective with that too much fat is it can start to cause digestive issues. It can start to cause increased fullness because you can get bile dumping from it. The fat will drastically delay gastric emptying. So you could be super full, feel like the food is sitting there forever if your fat's really high in the meal. And
that takes longer to go through.
So what happens is fat stimulates digestion, and a lot of people who go low fat will find that they don't have that bile acid output. Those bile acids will stimulate that gut motility to some extent. And so if you're really low fat, you can find, oh, maybe I'm constipated or my digestion's not as good. But if you're too high fat, the fat slows that drip of food out of your stomach. And so if what a lot of people find in keto, carnivore, low carb is if they're eating a 16-ounce ribeye with a bunch of butter on it, and they're at like, 50, 60, 70 grams of fat plus however much 50, 60, 70 grams of protein, you're not going to be hungry for the next 5, 6, 7 hours because the fat is going to delay that gastric emptying. You're going to feel really full. And then you have these increased satiety mechanisms from the protein. So what you want to wind up doing is finding a nice, like a comfortable amount of fat. It could be 30 grams, could be 20 something grams in a meal. For a guy your size, I'd probably put you closer to 30 grams per meal. And what I would say with those fatty cuts with the fatty cuts of meat is to have your fatty cut of meat, see how much fat if you're getting 30 grams of fat with your meat. And a lot of the fatty cuts of meat, say it's a nice ribeye or something, I usually don't have people eat massive boluses of protein in one sitting. So it's when I start to adjust the diet, it's not that 16-ounce ribeye for a meal. It's like 4 or 5 ounces of ribeye. And
my protein has gone down, even though I've gained muscle.
Yeah. So carbohydrates spare protein.
Yeah.
So because as I was discussing, if you don't have enough carbs on board, that protein starts to get converted to carbs through gluconeogenesis. But when you have enough carbs on board, you don't need to drive that gluconeogenesis. So you can spare your protein. In the research at this point, what you're basically seeing is that about 0.6 to 0.8 grams per pound of body weight is really the amount of protein that's optimal for people who are lifting, who are trying to maintain muscle mass, build muscle mass if they're in a deficit. So I would really stick there. A lot of people on low carb or keto go super high and they're having 1 pound of meat in one sitting. And so I would adjust the meat intake to maybe 4 or 5 ounces in one sitting. If you're going to go fish, you probably go higher because it's not as dense in protein. That'll also bring your fat down a bit because 4 ounces of steak, if you're having 4 ounces, you're probably going to get on a fatty cut, maybe 30, 35 grams of fat there. So that'll help to adjust that. And then I just wouldn't then throw butter on top of that and then eat cheese with the steak and dip your cheese in honey as well.
Okay, we're finding the issue. Okay.
Yes.
All right. So that's interesting. I will keep that in mind and try to make those adjustments. I think maybe that's what I probably ramped up the carbs a little too fast, and I didn't adjust on the fat side accordingly. So I might be more total calories than I need. And most of that might be because I didn't adjust the fat.
Yep.
I don't think I need to worry about not getting enough, and because it just seems to be so easy to get enough.
Yep.
Okay, what about the like the heartburn and the blow? Like, is it common? Because I assume you talk about juice a lot because you guys promote getting carbohydrates in a way that's easy to digest, like
Yep.
easy to get, where your body doesn't have to do a lot of work to get it. And juice seems to have value there. Plus, it has polyphenols, some positive things, and structured water, maybe all kinds of stuff in it.
Yep.
But is that common when people are adding juice that the acid itself creates you know, a burning sensation?
So heartburn and some digestive issues are common when you first start. And it's more of a function again of like the implementation. And this is where a lot of the implementation, like the principles and like the targets and stuff are easy to do. Like this is how much protein I have, but it's like, how do you organize your meals? How are you organizing them throughout your day? What's going on with your blood sugar? What's going on with your ability to use carbs, things like that. And then there's also other mechanisms that you start to dive into. So, and this ties into the idea that fat will delay gastric emptying and protein will increase satiety. So in your meal, say you're going to eat your I don't know, maybe 8-ounce steak, right? So you're eating an 8-ounce steak, you're having some cheese with that, you're putting some honey on the cheese, and you're like, oh man, let me finish this meal off with a nice glass of juice, 16 ounces. So now imagine you have this 8-ounce steak in your belly with the cheese and the honey, and you have like a pretty hefty amount of fat in there. So you're going to really delay that gastric emptying. And then now I'm also going to pour another 16 ounces of juice on top of that. So that when you do stuff like that, you'll find that creates a lot of pressure in the stomach. And then that pressure in the stomach can push back. And that's where you start to get some of the acidity. And a lot of times the fix is not, I don't necessarily think that the juice directly is causing it, but I think it's if you're combining a large volume of juice on top of a decent amount of fat and protein, and it's coming after you're eating those things and you're delaying that gastric emptying, and now you're really filling up your stomach, that can push back on that lower esophageal sphincter, and that's where you can get some of that reflux and that heartburn. The other thing to keep in mind is that your stomach acid is very acidic. And so if I took a bunch of fluid and I diluted that acid, it's not going to work as well. So now if you're putting in a big steak and then you're dumping in a bunch of fluids on top of that, say it's milk and juice, now you have a very basic fluid milk. Juice is a bit more acidic, but it's not down at the same pH as the stomach acid. You're diluting that, and now you're increasing that demand on the digestive system in one go. So the workaround for this especially from a digestive perspective, if my clients are dealing with that, so what I would have you do is I would have you drink the juice and have your dried fruit first. So drink those first. This is at your appetizer, right? This is your aperitif. You're getting ready to have that steak and whatever other components of the meal you're going to have. Wait about 10 to 15 minutes and then eat your steak and your fat after. So, and the reason I say this is the juice digests really rapidly. So what you'll find is if you load up on juice, so say you did like 20 ounces.
Oh, I'm not drinking.
Well, I'm
Okay.
using this as an example for you here. So like, say you did like 20 ounces of juice in one sitting, you'll probably notice that you're going to pee within the next 20 or 30 minutes. And that's indicating that you've already assimilated that juice to some extent, and the fluid is moved into your vascular system, and then your kidneys are excreting that volume.
That fast. Okay.
Yeah. So the juice digestion can be very rapid. So if you're having it beforehand, and you can digest the juice, you can kind of get it through your system a bit, and then you have that just 10 to 15 minutes later, you can have that protein, and that protein part of your meal, that's your main course, and then you should be good to go. You'll probably find that you have less digestive symptoms.
Okay.
Go ahead. There's another piece I want to add, but I'm sure if you have any questions, I don't
No,
want to
that's good. I
monopolize
mean,
it.
that makes sense. I do think that some of the experience I've had have been later in the day where I've been eating throughout the day and I have some juice, and then it seems to be problematic where I don't notice it, I think, early.
Yep.
I'm only having maybe 4 ounces at a time, 2 to 3 times a day of the juice.
Okay.
Organic juice expensive. That's one of the.
It is.
It's expensive. So
It
I'm like,
is.
let's not get carried away with this. Um, so yeah, I wonder if it's because I just got too much food in there. And it's funny because I do make a point to try to not drink that much during meals in the past, and everything's changed for me lately. I'm like, oh, let me just try this, do this, do this. I'm like, oh, maybe have to be smarter about it.
Yep.
Um, okay, I will play with that idea and see how that works. I appreciate that. The last thing, um, the bloat, is that possibly just my machinery is just not up and running yet for this amount?
So this ties in again also with the juice piece to some extent. And there's two other points I want to add to that, but that will also tie in with this. When you're constructing a meal, say you're just first piece is if you're just having steak, you don't have any other vegetable fiber or cooked vegetables or fruits or whatever with that. There are problems with proteins going and then like heme iron from the steak and bile acids going into the colon. When they make their way into the colon, that's where your microbiome is really situated. The microbiome, the bacteria there will produce a bit of toxic compounds from those components. There's a whole list of them: indole, scatol, ammonia, p-cresol, hydrogen sulfide, etc. So usually what I recommend as well is to add some type of cooked vegetable or some type of plant fiber with your protein source, because it serves to dilute the protein that goes into the colon and minimize some of those toxic compounds. And then the polyphenolic compounds, those plant antioxidants, help to modulate the microbiome in a beneficial way. And on just a little side note on those, a lot of people don't really know, but the polyphenols aren't really absorbed. Those plant antioxidants aren't heavily absorbed by us. Most of them actually make their way to the colon, and then the microbiome metabolizes them into different compounds and then will absorb some of those compounds. So those are, you can kind of think of as like selective ecosystem modulators or selective antimicrobials. They select more for beneficial bacteria or microbes in the gut, and they kind of crowd out the negative ones. So having some cooked carrots, some cooked squash, some cooked peppers. I like peas personally. I know it's not super bioenergetic or carnivore or anything, but I have that. So I'll have a meal for me. This is an example for you or for the audience, could be 12 ounces of juice, some dried fruit or fresh fruit. And then what I'll do is I'll wait, that 10 to 15 minutes. And then I will eat like a plate that has some, whether it's fish or seafood like shrimp or scallops or red meat, something along those lines. And then I have some cooked vegetables on the side. And then whatever fat source or other spices and things I'm going to use to make it taste better. So like if I use ground meat, I'll have some tomato sauce in there. So it's still like it can fit within that paleo-esque idea. But
you say it could be from the protein, from the iron and the protein hitting the large intestine.
So that's one piece. So
because from what I thought that protein was pretty much managed in the small intestine, and when I ate high protein and had very little fiber, like I didn't have it.
Yeah. So, well, there's another piece I'll bring on, but
okay,
the protein, about 95% is absorbed in the small intestine. So you're getting about 95% of that absorbed, but there is going to be that 5% that will make it to the colon. And so when you start to add these other foods on board, say you're adding fruits, say you're adding dairy, say you're adding cooked vegetables, whatever the deal is, number one, you will have a shift in your microbiome. And then number two, you will also alter to some extent how much protein is making it into the colon versus not. If you're just doing like a mostly meat and protein diet and you minor berries here and there or something like that, then you're probably going to be better at absorbing that meat than you'll have a different microbiome profile than if you had all these other things on board. So that can adjust it as well. Now, the next piece to keep in mind with that is timing between meals. So in the bioenergetic sphere, when people start to come onto this, they wind up eating all day long. Have some orange juice here, I'll have a little cheese there, I'll have a little honey on here. There's a system in your intestine called the migrating motor complex. And this system, it's essentially like a software program that tells your intestine to contract in a rhythmic fashion and move food and debris and bacteria and everything out. down and out, moves it all the way through. This system takes roughly 3 hours for one cycle to like move everything through. The kicker here is that every time you eat, you restart that cycle. So if you're grazing all day long, you can constantly be restarting that cycle, and your body's like in the process of digesting and moving the food along, and then you're restarting. And so a lot of people wind up getting bloated because they're doing some milk here, a steak here, some juice here, and they're not actually having situating themselves to have like an actual meal, waiting a 3 hour or 4 hour window, having a meal, waiting a 3 hour, 4 hour window, and having that meal. So that also can create some bloating under those circumstances.
And that's because you're just overburdening that system. It's working on this part of that migratory motor complex.
Yep.
And then you're adding something in, so it's like diverting resources maybe, or
it's just restarting that cycle. So you're just it's triggered by the hormones that trigger that cycle are released when you start to eat again. So when you're just grazing all day long, you're constantly like, I guess you can think of it in terms of overburdening the system to some extent, but you're slowly, like you're restarting all the cycles again with the digestive tract. The other thing,
how does that cause a sense of bloat though? Like, why wouldn't that just be a steady stream of low level activity or whatever if the meals aren't?
Because if you have some components in your food that are not digesting, or they're not being moved along or being assimilated appropriately because the system is starting somewhere else, then you can start to get like maybe a buildup of microbes in the intestine. So I've had some people have SIBO after doing this, which is that small intestine bacterial overgrowth. And basically the microbes can get a hold of it, and then they start breaking down some of those food components, and that can cause some bloating based on the metabolic products they're producing. Maybe it's gases,
right?
Maybe it's different metabolites like lactate, things along those lines. And so you start to notice, man, I don't feel terrible, but I'm kind of like, I'm a little uncomfortably full, or I feel kind of bloated or full. And I think it's a function, in my experience, has been largely a function of grazing.
I think you hit the nail on the head, man. I mean, when I was low carb, like I never had, like I could easily at any moment not eat, like no cravings. And now you're right. Like I'm so enjoying all this abundance that I am like, every time I walk by the kitchen, let me have some milk with maple syrup in it, chug it, go on to my next exercise. Like I'm overdoing it. The loaf of bread is out. Take a like I don't even need it. It's more of like I'm just like, this is just fun. So I think that's the place for me to try first. I don't want to like micromanage, I think, the order of my meal so much. Where it's like, well, let me time and get my fruit first and protein. I believe you that it works for some people. I'm trying to find, well, how do I make this fit my life really? So, and I am definitely grazing, and I didn't used to do that. So that is definitely, I would think, low hanging fruit for me to tinker with. I will do that. I have abused your schedule here, man. I did not expect to go this long. I really appreciate all that you've provided, you and Jay, a wealth of information. And I highly recommend, I mean, if folks out there want to take a deeper dive on a one-on-one level, the value you can get out of working with somebody one-on-one experience with this is, I mean, the upside is so high. If you wind up, getting everything dialed in for you. I feel like I'm really close to there, and I have like a few kinks to work out. So now I have some new strategies to integrate and see how they go. So I'm excited to do that. We went over a lot. Again, if you're listening to this and you haven't listened to the one with Jay, I would follow up with that so that this will make more sense. Mike, is there anything else that you would like to add before I let you get on to your day?
No, I appreciate your time. I appreciate the invitation. It was a great conversation. And then I would just want to plug, if anybody wants to find me, you can find me on the podcast with Jay at the Energy Balance Podcast. I have my own YouTube channel. It gets a little nerdy and goes into these different topics and very specific details with the research studies, but that's Mike Fave. That's the name of the YouTube channel. And then I also have a guide available for people that you can pick up on my website that goes through how to calculate your macros, how to calculate your calories, what foods to implement, how to adjust them, and some of these strategies that Les and I talked about today. You can pick that up on my website. So that's the only other things I'd want to add for people here.
Great. And I recommend everybody check out the Energy Balance Podcast. It is a very well organized piece of educational content that's very digestible, and you could just kind of methodically go in order and get a ton of education. You have a deep understanding of this stuff. I really appreciate you giving away this gift that you have. We will link in the show notes and description all the ways to reach out to Mike. Mike, thank you once again. Really appreciate it, and appreciate the personal help. I'm obviously doing this for selfish reasons to some extent, to learn and just bringing the audience along for the ride. For the listeners out there, I hope you got some value out of this, and I encourage you to check out Jay and Mike's work. I hope everybody has a great day out there.
Thanks for having me.
Well, I want to thank everybody again for tuning into this episode. I really enjoyed my talk with Mike. I feel like I got some valuable tips that I look forward to implementing and seeing how that goes. I do encourage you to check out the Energy Balance Podcast. Just start at episode 1 and get a very powerful education that could help shape the way you look at the energy that you're creating and the energy that you need in the best way to make those things match. If you have any questions, then please send them my way, and I'll do my best to answer. And if I can't, I'll try to get Mike or Jay to answer for you. Thanks again for tuning in. I hope you have a great day.